Welcome to the Agency of Forgotten Histories. Our mission is to uncover the literary echoes woven into the streets of Islington, the untold stories of poets, novelists, and radical thinkers who shape not just the written word, but the world beyond the page. Oh, today's case, literary influence. Islington has been a hub for writers, publishers, and movements that challenged the status quo. The evidence is everywhere. Blue plaques, bookshops, former haunts of Dickens and Orton. Each one a clue, each one a piece of the puzzle. And today, we're putting it all together. But to get to the heart of it, we need someone with the right kind of knowledge. Someone who knows where literary ghosts still linger. Jane. Ah, Mokshika, you're here. Time to pass the baton to you. I need you to meet Jane from Islington Guided Walks. Follow the trail of ink and parchment and report back to me with your findings.
Okay, boss. I'm on it.
Step outside, follow the words, and see what you find.
Hello, Jane. I've got a new case from the agency. We need to uncover Islington's literary past, the authors who lived and wrote here, the stories that still shape the area.
Well, that's great. You've come to the right place. Islington's absolutely slathered in literary history. For instance, we've got Charles Dickens, who walked the streets of Smithfield. We've got George Orwell, who wrote his books and drank in certain pubs in Islington. And we've also got, more recently in the 1960s, people like Joe Orton, a very interesting character who lived close to Upper Street in Islington. So I can send you to some people that can help you with this.
Oh my God, that all sounds so fascinating. So where should I really start?
How about I send you to Jonathan? Jonathan knows a lot about Charles Dickens in Islington. You'll love it.
Amazing. I'm really looking forward to then.
Hello, I'm Jonathan, and I'm going to tell you all about Charles Dickens and Nelly Ternan. So we're standing in a road called Northampton Park in Islington, opposite a small grey one-storey cottage called Park Cottage. And this was in 1857 the home of a young woman called Ellen Ternan, although she was widely known to friends and family as Nelly. And while she was living here with her mother and two sisters, she met a certain Charles Dickens. And at that time, Dickens was 45 years old and she was 18, only 6 months younger than his youngest daughter, Kate. But it was the beginning of a relationship which lasted for 13 years. It has been widely reported that it was an amorous relationship, but there is no actual proof. Whatever the nature of the relationship, it lasted 13 years until Dickens died at the age of 58, and it was close. But I think possibly speculation about it was encouraged by the fact that Dickens tried to keep it quiet, because he had a towering reputation, one of the most famous men in the world, and he didn't want any hint of a scandal to emerge, which possibly encouraged more scandal, at least rumours of scandal, to emerge than he might have wanted. But they met because in 1857 they were in a play together, together with other members of the family. As I said, the relationship, the nature is really unknown, but it happened to coincide with the end, or towards the end, of Dickens' marriage of 19 years to his wife Catherine. And he insisted always that the end of that marriage was above board. It was just provoked by the fact that they didn't get on. And he said about the end of his marriage, Dickens said, "Mrs. Dickens and I have lived unhappily together for many years. Hardly anyone who has known us intimately can fail to have known that we are in all respects of character and temperament wonderfully unsuited to each other." And he said, "Two wicked persons, coupled with this separation," i.e. from his wife, "the name of a young lady for whom I have a great attachment and regard. I will not repeat her name, I honour it too much. Upon my soul and honour, there is not on this earth a more virtuous and spotless creature than that young lady. I know her to be innocent and pure and as good as my own dear daughters." So he was really trying his best to say whoever's suggesting there's something else going on here is wrong. But saying that in itself drew more attention to it because this was widely read everywhere. Might have been better off just being quiet about it. In 1865, June 1865, Dickens and Nelly and her mother Frances were travelling on a train. They'd been to Paris and they were travelling back through southern England on the train when it derailed at a place called Staplehurst, killing 10 people and injuring 40 people. And the first class carriage in which Dickens and the two women were sitting had been derailed, turned over on its side and was kind of teetering over a precipice. And Dickens managed to climb out of a window to safety and help the two women accompanying him to safety. He then spent 3 hours until help arrived, tending to other passengers with a bottle of brandy that he happened to have with him, and his hat filled with water from the river, just where the accident took place. There have been novels and a film and a play which basically make the assumption that it was a love affair, and she's widely reported as being Dickens' mistress. I'd say the jury's out.
Thank you so very much for your time.
Well, thank you, and I'm glad you enjoyed it. When I discovered this story, I was intrigued by it.
I'm very much interested to know about the other legends of literature, Charles and Mary Lamb. So who do I get in touch with?
Well, if you want to know about Charles and Mary Lamb, you must speak to my friend Alan. He'll tell you everything you need to know.
So we're just behind near the Angel tube station here, not very far away, one of the main centre points of Islington, the borough of Islington. And we're going to head towards the cottage where Charles and Mary Lamb lived in the early 1800s. Charles and Mary Lamb were most famous as co-authors of a children's book called Tales from Shakespeare, which they wrote in the early 1800s together, and it's still in print today. Remarkably, 200 years later, they became very famous for that, but also they were a centre of a literary movement. They ran a weekly literary salon, and their friends included people like Wordsworth, Mary Wollstonecraft, the early feminist. She was a friend of theirs, as was her daughter Mary Shelley, who indeed went on to write Frankenstein herself, and other authors of this time, including, Mary Shelley married Percy Bysshe Shelley, the famous poet, so they knew him as well. And they ran the centre of this literary movement in London, of romantic literary fiction, which we still value today. Charles Lamb's biographer called him the nicest man in English literature. He obviously was a very welcoming host. They came from quite an impoverished background, the Lambs. Their father was a clerk in a barrister's chambers in London, and the barrister, a man called Salt, paid for his education at a very good school called Christ's Hospital School, which was then near St Paul's Cathedral. And there he met his lifelong friend, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And I think that link was the bedrock of the fact that they were lifelong friends. He was the nicest man in English literature. He had a very, very popular newspaper column, which they like to appear in from time to time, these authors. But it was the centre of that new romantic literary movement. Mary Lamb, in her letters, we have quite a few letters from Mary Lamb, talks about going to visit William and Dorothy Wordsworth in the Lake District. But she doesn't seem to have been very impressed by the Lake District. Many people assume that they were a married couple, but they weren't. They were brother and sister. In actual fact, Mary was 9 years older than Charles, but they had a very close bond between them. And although Mary didn't have an education at that time, the idea of a daughter from an impoverished background being sent to good public school was highly unlikely. She learnt a lot from her brother and was obviously highly intelligent, and she can more than hold her own in the literary evenings they had on salons, and obviously she wrote half of the tales from Shakespeare. She tended to do the comedies and he did the tragedies, and what they did was they simplified the plot so that they were understandable to children, but they didn't dumb down the language. They used Shakespeare's own language and kept as much of it as they could, because that's where they felt the the actual glory of it was, and that still remains the case today. And some modern authors like Margaret Atwood, Michael Morpurgo, they've tried their own tales from Shakespeare on the same style, the same kind of formula of trying not to dumb it down but to convey it to children. So that's part of their literary legacy. Now we've arrived at Colebrooke Cottage. You can see the name of it over the glass, and we see the LCC, that's the London County Council, and this plaque here put up to, it says Charles Lamb, quote, Elia, his pen name, and we passed the street named after his pen name, Elia Street, a little earlier, 1775 to 1834, essayist lived here. It says that's his light essays in the London magazine for which he was famous.
Why is there no Mary Lamb written on the plaque?
Yes, that's a good question, because the Lambs, as a family, they had a dark secret. In 1796, there was a history of mental illness in the family, and both Mary and Charles suffered mental health issues. And in the autumn of 1796, Mary had been working as a seamstress and had an apprentice, a young girl, in the house, their home, who was teaching her how to be a seamstress. And one day her mother, who lived with them, reproached Mary for telling off the seamstress, the apprentice, very sharply, for shouting at her, really. And she reacted very, very badly to that and picked up a kitchen knife on the table and stabbed her mother through the heart. And Charles Lamb, he was there, and he wrote in a letter that day to a friend, he said that I was at hand with only time enough to snatch the knife out of her grasp. She is at present in a man-house, from whence I fear she must be moved to a hospital. God has preserved to me my senses. I eat and drink and sleep, and have my judgment, I believe, very sound. My poor father was slightly wounded, and I'm left to take care of him and my aunt. Now, there was an inquest into the mother's death, and the coroner recorded the verdict of lunacy on Mary. Now, normally that would have meant that she would have been sent to a lifetime of very harsh regime at the notorious Bedlam Mental Hospital at the time. But Charles managed to persuade the authorities that he would look after her at home on the condition that if they went out, she had to wear a straitjacket. So initially the publishers didn't put her name on the Tales from Shakespeare. So you think maybe not necessarily for feminist reasons, anti-feminist reasons rather, but rather that he thought that having the name of a murderer on the book wouldn't necessarily sell. Of course, these days it may be would be regarded as a major promotional tool, but she wasn't credited as a co-author of the book until the 8th edition in 1836. But here we are, even 100 years later, when the LCC put up the plaque, they haven't included her name, which is a bit of a scandal, really. But even so, all these great literary figures of London, the Wordsworths, the Shelleys, Hazlitt, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, they still came, and they were quite happy to spend their Wednesday evenings listening in the company of Charles and Mary Lamb.
So were these authors aware of this dark history?
They were very much aware, yes, but they kept it a secret amongst themselves. And Mary held her own in these literary evenings, and indeed Charles thought that her writing and talking about literature was a very therapeutic way of and helped her calm her and eased her mental issues. And indeed they didn't tell anyone until after her death. As now people have talked about talking therapies and using art, and but I don't see why not literature as well as a way of therapies for people who are trying to struggle with mental health issues. I think they were very forward-thinking and very enlightened at the time. But there's also a very, very close bond between Charles and Mary. And I perhaps should also add that it wasn't all one way. It wasn't just Charles looking after Mary. Towards the middle and end of his life, Charles, like many journalists, became a bit of an alcoholic. He was quite a serious alcoholic later on. And Mary actually looked after him and took care of him when he was having a pretty bad way and pretty difficult to handle. So I think there's also that very, very close bond between the two of them that was important.
Thank you, Alan, for this tour. I really enjoyed it, and it was amazing to listen more about Mary Lamb as well. But I'm also intrigued about Joe Orton's life. Where do you think I would find more on this?
Ah, Joe Orton, the playwright, you mean? Ah, you want to go and have a chat with my colleague, Chris.
Hi there, so my name's Chris. We're here in 25 Noel Road, where the playwright Joe Orton lived and notoriously tragically died. He moved here in 1959 with his infamous partner Kenneth Halliwell, had a huge meteoric success, and then unfortunately died in his prime, basically, in 1967. So Joe Orton was born John Orton. He was a working class lad from Leicester. He applied to join RADA, the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art in London. And that's where he famously met his partner and early collaborator, Kenneth Halliwell. Now, Kenneth was a few years older than Joe, but they worked together and they wrote together, and they eventually moved here in 1959. But they were both rather mischievous. They would go down to the library just down the road, the South Library, and they'd take art books, rip out some of the pictures, and they basically plastered their wall with all of those classical photographs and pictures. But they also more notoriously decided to take some of the library books, which they thought were a bit boring, and then rehash the covers. And they'd also take the library books, and inside they would type ridiculously fake and sometimes very naughty and sometimes very filthy blurbs with fake stories. So they would have great fun going in and watching little old ladies and people being horrified at these things. They eventually, though, were caught, and they both ended up being sent to prison for 6 months, which seems quite harsh, but they were both living together. Joe Orton especially was very openly gay when it was illegal to be gay, and he thinks that their sentence was unduly harsh because of their sexuality. If you're interested in seeing any, you can pop down to the Islington Museum and you can see some of the original library books, which, although they were eventually fined and sent to prison for, are now celebrated in Islington Library for their ingenuity and their humour. So Joe and Kenneth were sort of quite different, really. Joe was quite relaxed, he was quite funny. Kenneth was a little bit morose, he was a little bit older. He'd gone bald prematurely, so he used to wear a wig. So they would go to parties, and Joe would be the life and soul. He was charming, he was funny, he was witty, and Kenneth would be in the corner complaining and moaning and wanting to go home. So it was quite clear that they were quite different personalities. And also there was the beginnings, now we know what happened in the end, of Kenneth's depression, basically. But anyway, they carried on writing. Joe began to get some interest in his work, and he sold a play to the BBC. So that play kick-started his career, and he wrote a play, a very famous play, called Entertaining Mr. Sloane. Now, his plays were quite funny. They very much made fun of the establishment. The plays were, initially, some people loved them, other people didn't. They thought they were a little bit challenging or what have you, but he didn't really mind about this. And when people were shocked, he used to write himself under the pseudonym of Edna Wellthorpe, and he used to write and complain about how awful these plays were, and he got some of these letters published. So Edna would write to the Times saying, "What kind of a playwright writes this filth and this dirt and what have you? I went there with my niece and we stormed out. I'm going to write and complain to the powers that be." And it was Joe himself. And of course it created more interest in Joe and more outrage. So he absolutely loved it. So he was quite mischievous, as his plays were mischievous. But he had a huge hit with his second play, Loot. And this was a play that was very much about police corruption. This launched his career because he won the Best Playwright Award for 1966 by the London Evening Standard. So this really put Joe on the map, basically. People knew about him. He was becoming quite famous. Poor Kenneth, of course, would go to these parties, go to the openings. People would ignore him. Joe would try to get him involved, but he was always quite dull and depressed and wanting to go home. But it was quite clear that they were moving apart, in a sense. Joe was becoming very famous, and he got offers to develop his plays in America as well. So Entertaining Mr. Sloane and Loot became huge successes in New York. So he really was come a long way from being this working class lad from Leicester, coming down to London, being unemployed for several years, going to prison for 6 months, to suddenly winning Best Playwright. And he was referred to as the Oscar Wilde of the welfare state. And his really big break came when the Beatles manager, Brian Epstein, rang them up and said, the Beatles have made a few very funny films. Would you be interested in writing a script for the Beatles? Who's going to say, no, I'm not going to write a script for the Beatles? So he writes in his diary about meeting Epstein in his house near Sloane Square, and meeting Paul McCartney and talking about what a nice time they had, and how Paul McCartney was a working class lad from Liverpool, Joe Orton was a working class lad from Leicester. They got on really, really well. So he did write a script called Up Against It. They didn't film it in the end, partly because of what happened to Joe, but also partly because the characters in the film were all smoking drugs and doing things that people did in the 1960s. But this was before the Beatles got into their hippie phase, so they were all still wearing their suits and being very, very nice, four nice gentlemen from Liverpool. So the film was never made, but there was the potential for it to be made at the time. And it was at this time when Joe was at the height of his career, winning national awards, having his plays produced in other countries, getting an offer for the Beatles, that he came back one night, and this is in August 1967, and we don't exactly know what happened. We know from the diaries that Kenneth Halliwell had been very depressed in the few weeks before that. A car had been arranged for the morning after to pick him up to meet his agent, Peggy Ramsey, in Covent Garden. They couldn't get in to this door behind me, so they knocked, and the person that lived in the flat below let them in. And the driver, who was meant to pick them up, opened the letterbox, and he could see there were two bodies inside, so he called the police, and the police entered. And unfortunately, what they found was that Joe had been battered about the head, and that Kenneth had then taken an overdose of sleeping pills. Kenneth had left a note that just said, "It's all in the diaries." When they found Orton's diaries, Orton had talked about what had happened with Halliwell's depression. Other people knew this, but also he'd written in his diaries that he was fed up with Kenneth and considering leaving him. So whether this was a really difficult time. Obviously, Kenneth was mentally very, very ill and at a low point, and this may well have been the straw that broke the camel's back. We'll never quite know. But I would recommend people to read the plays. They're outrageously funny. See the films, and also pop down to Islington Museum and have a look at their books, because they're really outrageously funny. So he left a wonderful legacy for us, not just in Islington, but everywhere really, and one of the probably most famous playwrights of the middle of the 20th century. Okay, so it's great to meet you, and great to talk to you about Joe and share his interesting, funny but tragic story. But yes, I hope you really enjoyed it.
Woo! Jane, I'm back! And wow, what a journey through Islington's literary past. Well, walking these streets really felt like stepping into the pages of history. Standing where Dickens once found his muse, I stood on the side of Lamb Household, a haven for literary greats, but also the backdrop of Mary Lamb's tragic secret. And then there was Joe Orton. His rebellious spirit still lingers in the air.
I'm really pleased that you found out so much and that you're enthused by the things that you learned. But there's so much more to explore here in Islington. That's what's so great about being an Islington guide, that we can share our knowledge with people like yourself who want to find out more. And if you want to find out more about other writers and other people who lived here in Islington, you can just simply go on our website and find out all the different walks that you can go on. There are tons of options to choose from. Just go to islingtonguidedwalks.com for more information and book your next walk. And we're really looking forward to seeing you again.
Welcome back, Mokshika. So, what did you find?
Well, I found more than just facts. I uncovered a tapestry of lives woven through the streets of Islington. But the most surprising connection of it all, that behind every famous name was a network of writers, friends, allies, secret keepers, whose stories are just as powerful as the ones they wrote.
Well, that's another case wrapped up. Another literary mystery solved. I'll want that report on my desk by tomorrow. First thing, okay?
Sure thing, boss. First thing in the morning.
Case closed. Oh. You've reached the Agency of Forgotten Histories. How can we help you? Very interesting. Well, I'll pass the message along to one of my detectives. We'll be right on it. Oh, looks like we got another forgotten history to uncover.
This has been the Agency of Forgotten Histories, presented by Islington Guided Walks and City St George's, University of London. Thanks for listening, and check out the show notes in your podcast player for links. The executive producer was Sandy Waugh, with thanks to Jane Parker and the tour guides at Islington Guided Walks.